If you've been listening to the Business of Biotech podcast for a while now, you'll recall that Erin Harris has joined me to co-host a few episodes. Erin's my friend, colleague, and chief editor over at cellandgene.com, and she just recently launched a podcast of her own. It's aptly named Cell and Gene, the podcast. And if you're working in the cell and gene space, you should give it a listen. It's a collection of interviews with the industry and academic leaders moving the space forward. And you can find it at cellandgene.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Cell and Gene, the podcast. Check it out. This is the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's show, we're digging in to make sense of yet another somewhat vague and somewhat esoteric industry phrase, flexible manufacturing. So as a communicator in the space, I'm as challenged as the next guy to take complex and multifaceted concepts and package them up into a few concise yet descriptive words. That's why I'm sympathetic to buzzwords, despite my disdain for those as nondescript as flexible manufacturing. So here to help me unpack what flexible manufacturing means, what it entails, how it's advanced, and how it's benefiting advanced therapy developers and manufacturers are Sarepta Therapeutics Director of Pharmaceutical Engineering, Brian Winstead, and Tony Corey, Project Pharma EVP and longtime friend and contributor to Bioprocess Online. Now, Brian has got a lot of credit on the topic. Before joining Sarepta a bit more than a year ago, he led capital expansion and engineering projects at a veritable who's who of drug manufacturing companies, including CSL Behring, DPS, Sandoz, Pfizer, and Wyeth. Today, he's bringing the diversity of those experiences to Sarepta's incredibly deep and diverse pipeline of RNA gene therapy and gene editing candidates for rare disease. For his part, Tony brings a lot to the table as well, having contributed to manufacturing operations and leadership roles at Boehringer Ingelheim, Amgen, Sandoz, Gilead, and Avexis, among others, prior to joining Project Pharma about 5 years ago. And as I just found out in our pre-show banter, Brian and Tony worked together for a while at CSL Behring back in the day. So Brian, welcome. And Tony, welcome back.
Thanks for having us. It's good to be back.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's always my pleasure. Now, I didn't mean to start the conversation off on sort of a cynical note when I, threw that whole flexible manufacturing industry buzzword kind of commentary out there. It just seems that lately I've been doing a lot of these podcast conversations and Bioprocess Online live events about things like, process intensification, flexible manufacturing. Like, yes, the words collectively mean something, but boy, they can mean a lot of things, a lot of different approaches, right? And being a simple-minded Pennsylvania boy, as I am, I like to start at a definitive level. So let's do that. Brian, let me start with you. What's sort of the definitive explanation of those two words together?
So flexible manufacturing, in my mind, can, as you say, mean a lot of different things. It is kind of the holy grail for those people out there that want to start up a facility. But really, flexible manufacturing to me is the design of facility that allows for multiple products to be manufactured within a single space without much modification or change to that space. Meaning you can bring a cell therapy type product through in an adhesion type media type situation, or you could bring a suspension material in at another time. And so it allows that flexibility, whereas in the past, traditional manufacturing spaces have always been designed for one product. You'll find it in multiple facilities. You'll go in and they'll say this suite was designed for product X, and that's all that it can do because of the limitations of that design. So flexibility to me means just that. It allows you to do multiple products, multiple various processes in the same suite without doing physical changes to the suite itself.
Okay. That brings up a couple of follow-up questions that I want to dig into, but not before I give Tony an opportunity to respond and either corroborate or add to what you just described, Brian.
Yeah, I think Brian hit it on the head. Hit the nail on the head. It's a lot. It's having the bones and the infrastructure to accommodate different technologies, right? In this time, the reason why flexible manufacturing is such a hot topic is we're in a massive breakthrough in advanced therapies, right? And with that, we have over 1,300 products in clinical trials. New therapies are coming through the pipeline, and the demand for us to be flexible as the product matures through the life cycle is critical. And that's why companies need that flexible capability and single use capability. So that's what's really driving this. And having manufacturing solutions that can accommodate different technologies while we mature the product through the product development and analytical development cycle is really what's important, and is really a key driver to why we're doing this and the importance of it. So.
Yeah. So, okay. So the follow-up is a question that is perhaps impossible to kind of crystallize a response to. No problems. No problems, right, guys? Just throw it. It's an impossible question to answer, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Flexibility is it's sort of an arbitrary term, right? Like there's flexibility that's cheap and easy and to some effect. And then there's, hey, we're extremely flexible. In fact, we've got all sorts of flexibility budget, right? Like, so the impossible question to answer is, when you talk about flexible manufacturing, what's reasonable? And at what point does the concept of flexibility become, at what point are we, would you look at the process or the system and say, we're flexible, we're not that flexible, perhaps?
I'd like to take that if I could to respond to that. So I look at that as if you were to take a product across what I call a family line. So for instance, vaccines as a family of products, or gene cell therapy as a family of products. But if I have a gene cell therapy facility that I've designed to be flexible for gene cell therapy, and you come to me and you say you want to make a tablet over the counter, I would look at you and go, I don't have that kind of flexibility. I can't do that. But I can do anything you want to do in the gene cell therapy world, which is that type of product, providing the size. And then the other piece is the size. So you start out, if you're in a, say, product development type level, you want the flexibility to allow you to, as Tony mentioned, to expand into the commercial. But yet, if you want it to go with multiple products running at the same time through that, that may not be flexible enough to do that.
Well done. Well done. I guess it wasn't as difficult a question as I anticipated, because you put that quite eloquently. Tony, anything to add there?
No, it's the same thing, right? Chemical-based processes, vaccines and diagnostics, medical device, biologics, microbial mammalian, cell therapy, gene therapy, CRISPR gene editing, all of these, family lines, as Brian highlighted, would require uniqueness to them. So, plasma therapies, things like that.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue. Maybe my simple question is a good segue to the conversation around why flexible manufacturing is appealing to or makes sense or particularly well suited to advanced therapy innovators. I don't know, Brian, you want to start out with that one, or?
It's very simple: speed to market. Mm-hmm. So right now, at least in the gene cell therapy world, speed to market is key. I mean, we have people that are in need of these medications, and you have people like, for instance, the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy world, where you have people who need this medication, to survive. And the faster you can go to market, the better. The faster you can take something, develop it, move it through the process, manufacture it, get it approved, and commercialize it, the better. So anything that lets you accelerate that is what you're looking for. And that's what these flexible type manufacturing environments provide.
I had a conversation, just quick follow up on that. I had a conversation on a previous episode, an episode that aired shortly before this one, with Anshul Mangal, who's the CEO at Project Pharma, where Tony Corey is, and Audrey Greenberg, who's the co-founder of Discovery Labs. And speed was, the conversation was about outsourcing decisions, insourcing versus outsourcing, and then choosing a CDMO. I was very careful not to let Audrey make it a commercial conversation. It was very informative. Also joining us was Sumit Verma from Iovance. Anyway, speed came up. What you just mentioned is the simple response to that question, Brian. And we had a discussion around that, and I get that. But a lot of times we talk about speed in advanced therapies as though boards and budgets, as if we don't need to answer to boards and budgets. There's got to be some balance there, right? I mean, there's got to be some. And we'll get into this. I want to talk a little. We'll have a conversation around the sort of the economics of flexible manufacturing. But tell me a little bit about that. How do you balance speed and economic governance?
That's an interesting question, the way you would bring that. So I guess I would say is the key to that is when you go to your board or otherwise, when you're talking about building a flexible facility, what you're telling them is that, hey, I can build it faster, which gets your drug to market, which gets you income revenue from that drug coming in sooner. I mean, the key I'm always going to say is we are trying to get to the patients faster. It is not a financial goal. It is all about the patient. I want to make that clear. But one thing that a flexible facility can do as you build it and such, if we take a normal drug and a normal time frame, it takes about 5 years start to finish. Really, if you start to build a facility, you get the drug in, you get it qualified, and you get it commercialized. It takes about 5 years, and that's on a highly based fast track. Now with these flexible facilities, with the ability to bring in pods or prefab, we can change that and reduce that down to, and Tony can test about a 24 to 30 month basis. And Tony sees this more than I have, but that's the speed. So I can go to my board and say, if you give me the funding, I can do this. The other thing is that the financial side of it is not, in some cases, it's not as expensive as building a facility of the past. When you're stick building it and you're having to do everything that you had to do before. Now I can go into a warehouse. I can take that warehouse, as long as it's got a large enough gallery with columns in the right spot. I can slide pods in, and I haven't had to go and invest in a brand new piece of property, dig up the ground and build a facility from the bottom up.
Right.
So those things I can offer to my board to get faster approval, which then gets us into the marketplace faster.
Cool. Right. Tony, what other elements of flexible manufacturing make it particularly appealing to folks in the ATMP space?
Yeah, I mean, just building off of what Brian highlighted, I think, so I'm honored and trusted to manage, probably $2 to $3 billion worth of capital in facility builds related to cell and gene therapy, scalable, flexible, single-use technology in the last probably 4 years. And in doing that, you get to see a lot. And one thing I'll highlight is about the cost that you brought up, Matt. If you're building a facility with single-use technology, it'll actually be less capital up front to build that facility and shorter timelines. So it's not just a speed item, it's also a capital investment. And then it's like, if you were to build a stainless steel big bioreactor, facility that accommodates a commercial, need, you're talking about clean in place capability, steam in place capability, and it's a whole different ballgame versus a single use technology that could, have proven, materials of construction for the product contact surfaces that are allowable in that space. So there is a cost item that is reduced, capitalized upfront. Reason being is that, remember, therapeutic revolution, tons of product coming in, they're in preclinical or early phase 1-2 clinical. We do want to invest the right amount of, funding or risk that funding commensurate with the maturity of the product through the clinical phases. And so I think that's an important item. Other parts is fewer resources, right? To operate the facility, you won't need as many people to run from a clean in place, steam in place operational perspective, smaller footprint. So when using, flexible technology, Brian highlight, you can grab a warehouse, you won't need as big of a footprint because you don't have these other cleaning and decontamination steps that are typically necessary in a non-single use environment. And then, I guess contamination risk would be my last item to just bring up to the team, just related to, when you're having to qualify cleaning cycles and steaming cycles and autoclaving and pyrogenation type initiatives, depyrogenation in this case, you wouldn't need to worry about that with single-use technology. Obviously, you have to remove the waste in a proper, safe manner, complying with, EH&S, type requirements, but the contamination risk would be another factor to.
Yeah, interesting. You talked about scalability real quick there, Tony. A lot of ATMP, a lot of cell and gene therapy developers are obviously clinical stage right now. I think you mentioned, Tony, like 1,300 clinical programs going on right now. So that's one scale. What does flexible manufacturing mean for what will hopefully at some point in the not too distant future become a big opportunity for commercialization of some of these products, right? Like the market should expand. We should see, the demand for more scale. Does single use support that? I'm sorry. Single use being part of flexible manufacturing. Does flexible manufacturing support that scalability that we all seek?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think flexible, I immediately think flexible, scalable, almost in the same breath. I mean, right now companies are growing into these facilities, right? And so they'll grab a footprint that's a couple 100,000 square feet, and then we'll grow into it. So we'll only use part of it in phase one, and then we'll scale up as the product continues to have clinical success, and then position it properly to, address the epidemiology of a commercial product, right? And so, having, flexible, scalable technology also allows, if, the thought is put up front properly and you consider it properly, to mitigate downtime, right? Because when we do expand that facility, we can pop in some modular solutions versus, knocking down all the infrastructure with the stick built potentially and then having to add another module. It really, when we're talking about there's pods or walls, different types of solutions like that, and they're single use. When you have a facility, though, it's almost like imagine your clean room becomes a piece of equipment or an asset, even from a financial perspective. If you can take the building, flip it upside down, whatever falls out, is depreciated financially based on the asset in a different table versus the building depreciation. So now your clean room becomes a piece of equipment, just like your bioreactors, your TFF skids, chrome skids, fillers. And so that's the idea around it. It also allows for portability and, potential opportunities to, move things around or adjust where needed versus stick build, for example.
Yep.
Now, I would love to invite Brian. Any other thoughts you'd like to add, please?
Yeah, I guess the only things I would add is, just on what you're saying is that the nice thing about prefab walls and such, if you design it properly, it's as easy as you pull a few pieces, a couple panels off, and you slide it out so many feet, and now you've doubled the size of your manufacturing space for one of your technologies as you grow. And that's one of the things, or you just have it set so that the interior walls are already there, and you just add in the other suite as you expand more prefab walls, and everything's there, the power, utilities, and you're just plugging in, and it's like plug and play. And it's either that or it's pods, as Tony mentioned, and you just add 2 or 3 more pods, you've got another suite, and you just keep adding as you need to expand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tony, you mentioned that concept or that notion of treating your clean room as a piece of equipment. Well, you can in fact do that today, can't you? This concept of prefabricated clean rooms, is that essentially what that is?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we were honored to be part of the first ever, now commercially approved gene therapy, FDA approved manufacturing facility in the U.S. And we treated it just as that. So, the clean room became an asset versus part of the building.
Yeah.
And, when PricewaterhouseCoopers or whatever companies come in to evaluate it from a financial perspective, it's, did you change the foundation? Did you impact? No, we were dropping in literally like Egos pods and then connecting them all. And yeah, those could, in essence be removed. It wouldn't be easy to do, but you could remove them just like you would with a filler. There's still, challenges with taking a filler out and relocating it, but you could do it.
I'm curious about that. That concept of a pre-manufactured clean room. Like you said, kind of drop it in like a Lego. Did you say Eggo or Lego?
Lego, but I like Egos too, so don't worry, Matt. That's good.
You drop an Eggo in and toast it. I don't know if it's an Eggo or Lego. Dropping it in like a Lego and
blueberry flavor.
Clicking it in place. I don't want to dwell here. I don't want to make this a conversation about architecture, but there are certain requirements of a clean room. Important requirements. Structural integrity and airflow and on and on. So in this concept of a prefab clean room, how do you go about ensuring that this, quote unquote piece of equipment that is a clean room meets all of those criteria?
So one of the things you do is if it's a pod, for instance, at the pod manufacturers, they will do a full FAT as you would just a piece of equipment. And you do just that. They put it together. You do all the airflows, all the testing, everything's proved out there. They're even doing some advanced qualification even at the pod manufacturer site. And then you bring in it and do an abbreviated SAT, and it's already been approved. I mean, the air handlers and everything that you attach, you either use their air handlers or you use your own. And if you're using your own, the only thing that you have to do there is prove out that the air handler is the same as what they use at the FAT. It's very basic. It's done all the time now. And so the finishes, the fits, all that are still standard CGMP that you would see. The floors, walls, ceilings, all the corners, all that's done just like the construction would be if it were stick built. It's all CGMP put together.
Right. Yeah, and that's perfect, Brian. I mean, I guess imagine all the utilities, just to further explain what Brian already highlighted. You have all these utilities for your piece of equipment, right? If you buy a piece of equipment, you need to have proper water supplies, gas supplies, right? Compressed air of some sort, whatever those are. That's the infrastructure and bones. With a clean room, same thing, right? You have certain utilities like an airflow, an air supply, that's a proper clean, and then electrical, right? These facilities, like when you're buying a pod, you'll have a testing apparatus at the manufacturer that'll have all the same supplies. And they'll say, hey, you need this much PSI coming in. You need to have this type of, electrical support and, X, Y, and Z. Take that same thing, drop it into a facility, make sure you have the right utility support to achieve that same type of run. So what's kind of neat is one time we did a build, the speed piece that Brian was highlighting, we hadn't picked a property yet. We bought pods. We bought all the long lead items, fillers, TFF, chrome, bioreactors. We started to integrate the clean rooms with the equipment, and we didn't even have a site selected. And then when we looked at a site selection, we made sure the site was big enough and could handle from a supply, loading docks, flows, ceiling heights, etc., support structure, all the stuff we already committed, which is probably about $20 million of funding committed. Once we picked the site, we made sure that all the sites, utilities were souped up, if you will, to accommodate our, all the stuff we'd already purchased. That's all happening in parallel. So now you've got a whole facility build and, facility utilities being souped up while I'm buying pods and integrating them with long lead equipment. And then eventually you connect them all together. So it was really neat to do something like that. Definitely kept us up a lot of late nights of worrying, but it all came together pretty nicely. So.
Yeah. Let's compare and contrast a little bit. Pre-manufactured clean rooms compared to stick-built clean rooms. And, I want to compare and contrast, and then I want to, talk pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages of each. And we've talked about some of the advantages of pre-manufactured clean rooms. Maybe a good place to start would be, are there circumstances where it just wouldn't make sense and perhaps I'd prefer to go stick?
I can answer that. So Tony and I worked on a facility where we had that same situation. We tried to decide, do pods make sense versus stick built, and we ended up going stick built. And the reason being was the facility had already been chosen. And by the time we got involved looking at the facility, it just didn't accommodate any of the prefab design, which is what Tony's saying is your prefab design works better when you can be working on the facility at the same time you're working on prefab design. This one, the facility had already been picked. We were in a time crunch, and it was just easier to go into the space, make the design, and then build the walls and put the finishes in. It's one of those situations where sometimes time and the facility it has to go in limits you on your capability of doing the prefab and making it effective. The other thing to bring up is something that you mentioned yourself earlier was prefab walls. You have to have a way of getting them in. If someone's bought a facility and they're trying to put this in the center of the facility, aside from maybe cutting open the roof and trying to bring panels in, it just doesn't work. And there again is another situation where it's easier to go with stick built than it is to do any kind of prefab or pod type arrangement.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. What are some potential drawbacks, other potential drawbacks around the prefab clean room? Any other drawbacks, or for that matter, any other pointed drawbacks to stick build approaches?
Yeah, we like to look at them in three buckets, right? There's stick build, there's this module wall solution, and then there's the pod or podular. There really are like three buckets if you kind of look at it. And from a stick build to a pod versus, just to compare those two and leave the module walls out because those are pretty attractive. Stick build is more cost effective. I also think stick build to pod, you can allow for more design changes during a stick build. There's a pod. With a pod, you got to go back to the manufacturer and modify the pod, right? So it's a little different from a logistical analysis. The pod is more beneficial when it comes to scalability, repurposing where possible, or mobility, timeline, of course. And then, just to throw the wrench in there, module walls can also be cost effective and allow for time design changes. Like Brian said, they can be really attractive for that. They do require a lot of attention up front, similar to stick builds, to do the proper design. Mobility isn't as attractive as a pod. It depends on how that ranks.
I think the other thing that to throw in is customized pieces of equipment can make stick build more attractive. So if you have a customized tank, or you have something like that doesn't fit a pod or doesn't fit the modular wall, or you have a suite that's built that way, and then you want to bring that customized piece of equipment, that's when it becomes a disadvantage versus, if it has to have some special exhaust or some kind of special utility connection, sometimes that's where stick build is better because you have, like Tony said, that capability of doing different modifications that you wouldn't necessarily have if you wanted, because you'd have to go all the way back to the pod. The pod guys would love you to come back to them because they want to sell you another pod, right? Yeah, we'll take your old pod out and we'll give you a new one.
Yeah. Whenever we have like tall, bioreactors, Brian and I always say pop the top, and a few other colleagues, because they're taller, right? And so you need to accommodate the clear, not just the bioreactor, but then the clearance to operate and maintain the bioreactor. And then you have the pod, and then you have to have clearance on top of the pod before you get to the ceiling height. And so when folks are like, "Oh, how high of a ceiling do you really need?" I'm like, "You need a pretty high ceiling, man. You add it all up, and it adds up pretty quick." So
Yeah, I mean, so inevitably there, maybe not inevitably, but often there may be a requirement for some, infrastructure or building change in any event. I don't know. Did we touch on the controlled manufacturing environments for fabricated, prefabbed clean rooms? Did we talk about that? Is that an advantage? Like the fact that you're having these things built in a controlled environment that, it comes in, as opposed to saying like, all right, we're going to seal these corners off, in the facility.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, right? Like if you're doing a stick build, you want to do the first build out. This is the best way to describe it. We always, when we're planning out a facility build, we say phase one of the build, it's dirty construction, have at it. Mm-hmm. Phase two is a completely different timeline, cost profile, and effort. Because now you're in change control land, you have GMP implications, you have clean room construction, right? So imagine a construction worker that used to just walk in and pile of dirt, and he's building out a facility. Now that person needs to have gowned up at certain moments, and it's a different level of effort, timeline, and documentation. So that's one thing to consider. When you do have a pod solution, you can do that build of the pod or the walls extra, offline. But you'll still, if you're doing phase 2 or 3, you still have to have the documentation part of it. But it might allow for ease in that expansion because some of that work is offline. It mitigates it down.
Yeah, I don't know. I just I guess I anticipated that might be a consideration. Sounds like that's not as big as a consideration as maybe I thought it might have been.
Yeah, not as much. I mean, it just depends on the phases.
Yeah,
much of consideration factor in there. But.
Good. Well, I want to spend some time talking about something that we talked about a little bit earlier, and single use, where adoption is there, and the advantages and disadvantages. Before I move on, though, are we good on prefab clean rooms versus stick built clean rooms?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
For now.
Cool. So yeah, where is adoption today on single use? Tony, you referenced it when we started the conversation out a little bit. I know that it's from my perspective, we see more applications of single use. We see more opportunities to adopt single use technologies because they're new single use pieces of equipment. What does the market look like, and where are we as far as acceptance is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, market-wise, industry-wise, it's accepted. It's a love-hate relationship, Matt. I don't know what to tell you. It's a love-hate relationship. I mean, it's exciting, right? The single-use industry, I think there's been some literature around it. Brian and I discussed it, just continuing to boom. There's projections out there in 2027, it could be a $33 billion industry. Now, why single-use? Why use it? Of course, from a timeline perspective and a cost perspective, upfront capital, you will spend less capital upfront if you implement single-use technologies, right? It'll just reduce cleaning and steaming operations and procedures and infrastructure and staffing, all that. At the same time, that's the love part of it. Mm-hmm. The hate part is because it's such an attractive solution, it's becoming a very difficult, material to, supply. Mm-hmm. And there's supply chain bottlenecks going with, that are coupling with that type of solution. So that requires commitments earlier, strategic thinking. Don't over customize your single use solutions. I think Brian and I talk about that all the time. Good is good enough. Don't try to make it the perfect, custom solution and have the single supplier have to make you something customized. In addition, right, single use technology breaks. That's just what happens, right? So when you're operating, I think when we rolled out that first facility ever, that was the first facility ever that now is commercially approved for gene therapy. That was a curveball. We had to have a whole team handling breakages and non-conformances and CAPAs that were, continuously taking place because things break, right? The single-use environment. So it's a love-hate relationship. Again, I kind of come back to that. Brian, I'd love for you to, give us your thoughts.
I got plenty of opinions on this one.
Mostly love or mostly hate.
No, actually, I mean, it's not. I mean, from the ease of use and that it's really convenience, right? I mean, instead of having to buy a tank with an agitator, you just buy a bag with an agitator. You plug it in when it's done. You dispose of it in the proper manner, and you're done with it. And tubing sets, all that stuff. It's from a contamination perspective. There's a love-hate there as well. I mean, the thing is, we have to have specialized training for operators, because they have to understand that the impeller that's inside the bag, when they're taking it out, you've got to be careful to handle it, that the impeller doesn't cut the bag, because if it cuts the bag and you start filling with product, and now you have product going all over the floor, and you've lost that product. Or the tubing set, if they don't weld it properly and they've taken it off the rig and they're starting to take it somewhere and the tubing starts to leak. Mm-hmm. You have all those where you have the capability of product loss as an issue. There's also, with the single-use technology, sometimes you get defective bags and defective things from the manufacturer. I mean, they do have their own quality, their own checks, but even some of that slips through. And you put $1 million worth of product into a bag and all of a sudden it's leaking, and then you have to understand, okay, what are we going to do with that? We can stop the leak, but now what about the product? The product is suspect, and CAPAs and investigations and more quality testing and things to make sure the product is okay from a contamination. We want to make a safe product. We want to make sure all that's good for the patient. And so we have to deal with that. So that's kind of the hate relationship that Tony's talking about it,
Yeah.
It's great when it works. It's terrible when it doesn't work. And there's really a happy medium.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave some of those anecdotes around bags and tube welds. Because I was going to ask, what Tony mentioned, it breaks. Well, what breaks? Are there other components that perhaps our audience might be, it's well served to know could or are likely to break?
I would just say, plastic is plastic, right? I know that it's not just a plastic, but anytime you have a plastic component, you have the opportunity for bad welds. You have poor injection mold was done with it when it was made at the manufacturer. And you can just have hairline cracks, things that your operators aren't going to see. And they won't know until liquid goes through it that there's a problem. And it's part of the life of dealing with a disposable piece is that. So
this may be a completely naive question, but I'm known for asking them. Is there any liability assumed by the manufacturer? Like, can you seek some sort of remuneration should these things happen based on a warranty, or I don't know.
Is this where I do the lawyer thing and say I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give advice? It depends on it. The manufacturers are good to work with you. Filters and things like that are certified. You can go back to them. They do want to know when there's issues. They will work with you. I know that Paul's one of our big, I don't want to give an advertisement, but Paul is one of our big suppliers, and they do work with us when we've found issues, and they have changed some manufacturing processes to accommodate some of the issues that have been found. So they typically will. It's based on how much they help you versus how much cost and material you've lost. There's no comparison, and they're obviously not going to pay you for lost product, but they will work with you if it's something that you seem to be having a constant issue with, or you find they want to know, so maybe they can make their product better. So for the next company or the next customer, they don't have that issue.
Sure. What's your opinion on, you talk about the love-hate relationship and when things go wrong, they go real wrong. What's your overall opinion, though, in these relatively early days on the outcome of single use versus, stainless and fixed?
Oh, I'm a big fan of single use. The operating expense around CIP, SIP, the time that it takes for the different pieces of equipment, tanks and things like that to go through those cycles, that I can run a bag, I can pull it off, I can move it, I can set another bag immediately and start another process run versus I've got to sit there and wait for the tank to go through the CIP and then turn on and wait for it to steam and sterilize itself. It's worlds above. And once your employees or your operators are trained and they understand what they're looking at and they know the pitfalls, you kind of see that negative go away. I mean, they start to, pick up on it. They'll know to look for certain things in the handling. So, I mean, I think single use is way hands above the regular just stainless steel in place type equipment.
Yep. Okay. Tony, I want to real quick jump back to something that you referenced earlier when you were talking about some of the not pitfalls, but considerations around single-use technologies. And I invite both of you to comment on this. But you said something about customization, and you alluded to maybe avoiding it, right? Like trying to work with what you have to work with. Where have you seen attempts at single-use customization perhaps gone wrong or gone awry, and how do you avoid that? Like any advice on trying to avoid custom single-use solutions?
Sure. Yeah. Good question, Matt. And you've seen it a lot. I guess it comes back down to truly listening to your partners, right? Mm-hmm. When your partner highlights, look, happy to accommodate what you'd like, but it will require us to customize X, Y, and Z. This will take multiple weeks, You have to hear that what they're trying to tell you is that this is complex and it would take a lot of effort versus using our standard component. And you see this happen at times when you have a mix of folks on the user side trying to make something perfect. And again, the goal is to make sure it's compliant. Number one, safety and quality is top. That's never negotiable. But when it comes to perfection, it's like, look, if all you got to do is put on a little clamp here and here, and you're good with the standard part versus adding an extra inch on each side and customizing it, you should clamp it. And the reason being is that allows long lead, it mitigates your risk around the supply, pricing of the materials. And then, from a vendor side, it allows them to be able to just mass produce things that you may need. So I really think that it's a trick, right? It's a trick to the trade to be disciplined. And if you are to customize, don't make it a customization for one piece of equipment for one little part. Like customize, make it standard, and then look at all the systems. And maybe you have like company X 1.1 single-use customization, but I'm going to order so many from them, to apply across the board. So you really got to be thoughtful and map it out. And it's a trick of the trade, right? I like single-use technology. I agree with Brian. When you're doing a commercial scale, you may want to reevaluate it and do some calcs around that and projections. But even then, it takes a lot of thought. There's going to be a multiple year evaluation to see if single use for stainless steel would work. Yeah. Environmental impact. Look, there's plenty of environmental impact when you're using gallons and gallons of water and chemicals and handling them and disposing of them. And the different steaming operations. So the environmental impact to me, it's definitely comparable or even attractive to single use. So it's a whole picture consideration. But yeah, that's the idea around the customization is let good be good enough and don't try to be perfect. At the same time, if you need something because it won't work, of course you got to make sure it's there. Quality and safety is critical.
I would bring one negative to single-use technology that's an artifact of COVID and what's going on right now. And that is there are 2 or 3 components in the industry right now that everyone is using in let's say the gene cell therapy market. And it's made it, it's like certain items have now become gold because it's hard to get them. And that's one thing, if I could caution people, is if you are going to buy certain things, you may want to consider qualifying a second vendor so that you have a second source. Okay. And unfortunately, some of those items, there is no second source because it's that new in the industry. And that's a drawback. But some of that is related to COVID because the vaccine groups are using the same stuff that we are. So.
Yeah, Brian, I was discussing this recently. We had a client private equity awarded them $100 million, 3 tranches, right? 30-some million, 30-some million. And we had presented and got the funding approved, worked out great, 5. They were like, we're going to give you tranche 1, then 2, then 3. And I came back and said, you need to give me tranche 1 and 2 today. Yeah. And they're like, why? And it's specifically related to supply chain and understanding that we need to commit earlier. And there's long leads, Matt. And what Brian's highlighting is new long leads. Yeah. So if we just say, oh, filler's a long lead. Well, yes, obviously, if you have the experience, you'll know that's a lead. But what you're not realizing is the vials are becoming a year plus lead time. That's not typical. Or even, some freezers and fridges or different items that are used in COVID become 6 to 12 month lead times. I actually have colleagues now in the space that are being contacted by the government going, hey, we created all these supply chain bottlenecks. Can you sit with us and help us debottleneck? We'll discuss funding strategies to debottleneck what we created during COVID. So it's really interesting to see, and getting a supply chain resource onboarded ASAP, and then explain to them not just your primary but secondary and tertiary lead times. I want you to evaluate all 3 filters. Nobody would ever look at filters during an early build. You need to look at them, and you need to have a place to put them. So those are all really good points, Brian. And they definitely, struck a chord with me for sure.
Yeah, I was going to comment when Brian brought that up, that potential downside of single use being long lead times and supply chain bottlenecks. And he referenced a few things, and he referenced that a couple of times, Brian. I got the sense that maybe Sarepta didn't want anybody else to know what those few things that are hard to get are, because it wants to kind of keep that under wraps, so it's got control of the supply.
No, never. No, we would never do that.
No, what are you mentioned?
Everyone knows. Everyone knows what they are. I could call up somebody at one or the other in a Vexus, and they would go, "Yep, we got that same problem." So, it's what it is.
Yeah. What are maybe the near term answers aren't right in front of us. How to mitigate those risks, those supply risks. What do you guys see as some long term solutions to making sure that you avoid getting into the situation that COVID has exacerbated in terms of supply chain and lead times?
I think the one thing is, if you can find an alternate that can supply you with the same component, that's always the first thing you try to do, because you can qualify them, and then you can have, access to both, some on the shelf for both, so that you can manufacture. The other thing I'm seeing is that the companies themselves that are making the components are actually realizing it, and they're quickly trying to put in capacity to supply to help the marketplace. But really, aside from changing your process, there isn't much else you can do to mitigate. Like Tony said, you can buy extra and put on the shelf. The only problem is certain things have expiry with them, and you have to be cognizant of what your usage is and that expiry to make sure that you don't end up with a whole bunch of components that are on the shelf that are no longer, usable for you.
Sure.
Yeah. And just building off, whenever you have a big supply demand discrepancy, right, there's going to be ways to fill those holes. So one is existing vendors are going to expand, like Brian highlighted, right? Having a secondary vendor, and then new companies are going to come to the market, hopefully being pulled from proven companies that then will fill that hole. So we've even seen some new equipment we've been using, similar instruments, similar equipment used in the lab, totally compliant. We've audited the vendor, new player in the space, and we're like, hey, we'll take that because we know fundamentally it complies with what we need from a process perspective and an analytical perspective. And not many people know about that company because they're newer to the market. So it's many ways to fill that gap, and when there's a demand for it, it finds its way to get filled. So if you have an existing supplier and they're expanding, good, right? If you have secondary supplier, like Brian said, great. Thirdly, you definitely have to do a little more legwork up front, but new companies coming in to fill that gap, you really need to make sure they know what they're doing and aren't just filling the gap. They're from that industry, and if so, they can be a great viable option.
Yeah. Is there relief in sight, generally speaking?
So I think there's some, but the problem is that on the gene cell therapy side, there's so many new ones getting online at the same time. It's going to be a little while before a lot of these gaps are filled, even with COVID going, if we get COVID under control and it goes away.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you get asked this all the time, especially in private equity. When do you think the imbalance will change? It's like, well, that's a great question. I mean, if we had that answer, we'd be playing a different game. But I feel like we get relief, and then more products come on board, and then we get relief, and more products come on board. And not just that, the products are progressing through the clinical trials, which means they're serving more patients. We're making more material. Then they become commercially approved. We're getting more commercially approved advanced medicines requiring more material. So it's this balance of, how much supply can come online and can it keep up with the increased demand from a product progression standpoint, as well as new product introduction standpoint. So yeah. It's this whole mix of factors for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of which are caused by positive market signals and positive signals for patients.
Exactly. Totally.
I just looked at the clock and I'm like, holy cow, we tried to bite off more than we could possibly chew on this episode. I feel like we could talk about single use forever. I've got a lot more questions for you. I've got questions about the environmental impact that you mentioned briefly, Tony. I've got questions about all sorts of stuff, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes, just kind of wrap up, give us some parting shots, parting wisdom on flexible manufacturing, whether that's prefab this, that, or single use this or that. Parting wisdom, specific obviously to ATMPs, gene and cell therapies.
Yeah, I'll kick it off, Brian, if you want to wrap it up after. I think my biggest piece of advice is, every time I come to do an assessment, folks come to me and they go, dude, isn't it the same thing for all the same? Don't we all have the same assessment? And I wish that was the case. If that was the case, I would have written an article, posted it online, said, hey, everybody take it. Let's save all the patients' lives. But there's so many unique factors, right? Mm-hmm. From the pipeline, the epidemiology, the yields, the scale, the maturity, the science, all these things that have to be reevaluated per company. The second thing related to single use and flexible is keeping a pulse on the latest technologies and best practices. They're changing. Everything is changing so rapidly that I have a team constantly working on this all day, every day, keeping up pulse. We're investing in it reoccurringly. And that the podular designs you see today were not the same in 15 or 16 or 17 up to 21. Neither are the wall solutions, neither are the stick. So equipment technology. So keeping that pulse and understanding that technology is evolving by the minute. I mean, we're actively working with vendors in confidence to produce new technology that will address a lot of these challenges. So there's a lot of creation going on, and you have to just keep a pulse on that. Mm-hmm. And that's a constant effort. So,
Brian, were you one of those guys telling Tony, come on, aren't these all the same?
I've always told him that. No, I get what he's dealing with in the marketplace. And the only thing I would add to all that is I want to see things get to that holy grail of flexibility that you were talking to earlier, where we can jump over families. But I really just want to see this acceleration continue. Back in my earlier days in the pharma world, it took so long to get a drug approved. And, now we're accelerating that with fast tracking things. And gene cell therapy, we're right at the tip of the iceberg. And I feel like it's just going to build on top of itself with the medications and the things we can do for patients. And the faster we can go, the more flexible we can be, the more people we can save. And that's really what attracted me to the gene cell therapy market in the first place, is that for once I'm curing or stopping the disease from continuing so that people can live. And that's the important thing. And so if we can make these manufacturing facilities more flexible and do it faster so that we get them to market faster, that's what we should be doing.
Awesome. That's perfect. That very, very sound advice. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you both for coming on the show, spending some time with me.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, man. This is great.
You're both doing important work. And sometimes it's great. We spend a lot of time talking about obviously the business aspects of biotech on the show, as per the name, the business of biotech. But sometimes it's nice to roll up the sleeves and talk a little bit about some of these business impacting functional elements at the engineering and design level. So it's been enlightening for me and educational. And I thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, man. Always.
So that's Brian Winstead and Tony Corey. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online. in partnership with Cytiva. Please visit cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech to explore a trove of custom curated content designed to help guide the emerging biopharma's journey. Then go sign up for my newsletter at bioprocessonline.com. And if you like what you heard here today, hit that subscribe button, give us 5 stars. And as always, thanks for listening.